Chapter 13. He had a death look. On November 22nd, Dr. Pepper Jenkins had lunch in the dining room at Parkland Hospital with several people from his anesthesiology department. We were grousing as we pushed around some fish croquettes on our plate, he told the author, because it had already been announced that Kennedy would be having roast beef at his luncheon because he had gotten a special dispensation by the Catholic Church to eat meat, and we were stuck with fish. During the lunch, the hospital began paging. Dr. Shires, chief of surgery, stat, indicating an emergency. And they never page the head of the departments, and never page them stat, recalls Jenkins. Dr. Ron Jones, one of the senior resident surgeons, was at our table, got up and answered the phone. I knew that Dr. Shires was out of town, Dr. Jones says, and the operator told me the president had been shot and was on his way to the hospital. It took a second to recover from that news, and then I immediately walked back to our table to tell the others. He was visibly upset when he got off the phone, recalls Jenkins. We were shocked when he came over and told us the president was being brought into emergency. Dr. Jenkins left to retrieve an anesthesia machine, while the chief nurse, Audrey Bell, went to prepare Trauma Room 1. The president's limousine screeched into the rear of Parkland, stopping near the emergency entrance. Governor Connolly appeared unconscious in the middle seat, lying across his wife, his shirt and suit jacket heavily stained with blood. Only President Kennedy's torso was visible as Jacqueline cradled his head in her lap. Blood and brain tissue were scattered over the seats. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had barely clung on to the rear of the car during the high-speed dash to Parkland, seemed dazed as he slid off the trunk. I was an OB-GYN, obstetrics gynecology resident, recalls Dr. Bill Midgett, who has never before spoken publicly about that day. I was in the emergency room nearest the door, and someone was disrupting my ability to take history from one of my patients because they were screaming for a gurney. I had no idea anyone had been shot. Because I could not carry on the conversation with my patient, I drew a stretcher and went out to find what was going on. The limousine was there when I went outside. There were any number of very serious people standing around with submachine guns, and I honestly thought I was not long for this world. I had no idea what was happening. Then one of the Secret Service men grabbed the other end of the carriage and hustled me toward this big black car, and all of a sudden Jackie Kennedy sat up, and I knew right away there was terrible trouble. Everyone was still in the car, all huddled down inside. Governor Connolly had to be removed before they could reach the president. Connolly suddenly became semi-conscious as the car stopped and, with a great show of determination, helped himself from the car before collapsing into the arms of hospital attendants. They raced him inside to Trauma Room 2. I stayed at the car, recalls Midgett. Then it was a matter of Mrs. Kennedy letting go of the president. You couldn't see the president's head at this point. Officer H.B. McLean, the subject of the acoustics controversy, walked over to the rear of the car. She was laying over him, he recalls. I gently grabbed her by both shoulders and said, "Now come on, ma'am. Come on out of the car, and let them take him inside." And she sat up and let go of him. It was obvious that when she sat up in the car, says Midgett, she knew that people were there to assist her husband. When I could finally see the president, I thought he was dead. I never saw anyone with a head wound like that, with the amount of brain matter scattered about that survived. We put the president on the gurney and wheeled him into emergency room 1. Mrs. Kennedy would not leave his side. She went in with us as the gurney was rolled into the hospital, walking right beside him, holding his hand. She was absolutely deadpan quiet. One of the nurses offered to clean off her clothing, and she said, "Absolutely not. I want the world to see what Dallas has done to my husband." Someone else asked if she wanted to wait outside the emergency room while they worked on her husband, and she said no, and went inside with the gurney. Everyone claims to be there first, says Dr. Jenkins. But the only doctor there when I arrived was Charles Carrico, and Doctors Baxter and Perry arrived shortly after me. Mrs. Kennedy was also there. The president was on the stretcher on his back, unconscious. He was blue-white, had fixated, dilated pupils, and slow, spasmodic breathing. There was initially no pulse. He had a death look, recalls Jenkins. He was on the way out. Two nurses, Diana Bowron and Margaret Henchliff, cut away the president's clothes and his back brace, which was wrapped with ace bandages about his waist and thighs. Note: examination of JFK's clothes later confirmed that the bullet that struck him in the shoulder/neck came from the rear. The back of his suit jacket had a bullet hole that pushed the threads inward, indicating the entrance point. The size of the hole corresponded to a 6.5 millimeter bullet. Spectrographic tests showed residues of copper at the edges of the jacket's hole, the same metal that jacketed Oswald's ammunition. JFK's shirt also had one hole in the rear, with the threads pushed in as well. The front of the shirt had nicks near the collar, with the threads pushed out, confirming an exit. There was also a nick in his silk tie near the knot, and because of the thread pattern, it is further evidence the bullet exited at the president's neck. End note. The doctors immediately noticed an external wound, a small wound in the neck almost directly under the Adam's apple. Dr. Carrico placed his hands under the president's back and felt for any other major wound. He did not find any. He missed the small bullet entrance in JFK's upper shoulder/neck. Nobody at Parkland ever turned him over. Dr. Carrico inserted a breathing tube into the president's mouth and down his throat, and an automatic respirator was hooked up to the tube. 3 cut-downs, slicing open the skin to find a vein, were done to give blood and fluids. As for the large wound in the head, Dr. Jenkins believes that few initially saw it. Jenkins had taken the traditional anesthesiologist position at the head of the table. "I was almost standing against his head," he recalls. "And as the room filled up with more people coming in, I knew then, and I know now, that most of them did not even know he had a head injury. He had a shock of hair, a big shock of hair, and he was lying with his head back against me. And by this time we had the EKG, electrocardiogram, hooked up to him, and it showed a dying heart pattern. People only knew that he had been shot, but they didn't know exactly where, and since there was a lot of blood, it was difficult to tell where it was coming from." Dr. Jones's account is typical. "When I came in, I did not know there was a head wound," he says. "I just saw the neck and was not aware there was a head wound for several minutes." Dr. Malcolm Perry started a tracheotomy, an operation in which an artificial airway is created by cutting into the throat and inserting a tube directly into the windpipe. "When Dr. Carrico was trying to get the endotracheal tube in, he saw blood in the trachea," Dr. Perry recalls. "So I did what I had done hundreds of times before. I put the tracheostomy right where the tracheal wound was. I had to control the airway, and if I did not put the tube at the point of entry, it would not work as well." That surgical procedure cut directly over the exit wound on the throat, and therefore, within minutes of the president's arrival, that wound was obliterated by Dr. Perry's larger incision. Doctors Baxter, Peters, and McClelland inserted a tube into the chest cavity to drain any blood or fluid. "I made an incision in the chest and put a tube in the right side," recalls Dr. Paul Peters, "and someone put one in the left. Ron Jones did a cut-down on the left ankle, and there was some admiral behind me, and he said, 'Get him some steroids.'" Note: the admiral was George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, who had been in the motorcade and arrived at Parkland several minutes after the president was wheeled inside the trauma unit. JFK needed steroids because of a deficiency in his natural production. Although it was a well-kept secret at the time, the president suffered from Addison's disease, a rare illness named after the English physician who discovered it. That disease slowly destroys the cortex of the adrenal glands, and while it is usually fatal, cortical hormones alleviate many of the symptoms. The president, in shock from the wounds, was in desperate need of the hormones since his adrenal glands were incapable of producing any. End note. Dr. Carrico set an intravenous solution of 300 milligrams of Solu-Cortef, a cortisone-based steroid. "As soon as we got the tracheostomy in," says Dr. Charles Baxter, "his pulse, which we had gotten to an erratic level near 100, started to decline. I glanced at his face, and his eyes were so bulged out. There was so much hemorrhaging that it was a little hard to recognize him as the president." The room was soon packed. "A lot of people came in, looked, and then went out," recalls Dr. Perry. And others came in and were asked to leave because it was so busy. Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent, walked around the room wild-eyed and disoriented, holding a cocked pistol. Another agent eventually came to take him outside. Jackie Kennedy continued to stand on the side, staring blankly at the frantic activities to revive her husband. Several times, a nurse or Secret Service agent led her outside, suggesting it was better if she did not remain in the trauma room. On one occasion, when she was out of the operating room, Lady Bird Johnson walked around a bend in a corner, and suddenly I found myself face to face with Jackie in a small hall. You always think of her as being insulated, protected. She was quite alone. I don't think I ever saw anyone so much alone in my life. I went up to her, put my arms around her, and said something to her like, "God help us all," because my feelings for her were too tumultuous to put into words. But Jackie always returned to the emergency room. That did quiet down the whole atmosphere, recalls Dr. Jones. You weren't sure you wanted to do everything you had to do in front of her. Once you did it, you weren't sure you should be standing there gazing. She would stand there with that look she had, says Jenkins. Then she would walk around with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. And on one of her trips back into the room, she nudged me with her elbow. The table wasn't completely occupied at the time, and she handed me part of his brain. No bone, just tissue. So I handed it to a nurse. I don't think Mrs. Kennedy would have any memory for the whole thing. The activity in the emergency room was frenetic. Note: Dr. Malcolm Perry says there must be 300 people who claim they were in there that day, and there's no way that could be true. It's interesting that most of us who were intimately involved don't talk about it, and the others do. End note. Parkland had the best trauma unit in Dallas, and if the president had any chance of being resuscitated, it was there. When we were working on Kennedy, he was not the president, recalls Dr. Adolf Giesecke. He was another life that we were trying our hardest to save. When we were in that room, we were doctors doing what we were trained for, but later we were just regular citizens, and the enormity of it hit us. Despite their efforts, the president still showed only an erratic pulse. Dr. Perry started closed chest massage. The doctors spoke about cutting open the president's chest and massaging the heart muscle. Dr. Jenkins, standing at the head of the table, noticed a priest, Father Oscar Huber, had appeared at the room's swinging doors. I asked one of my assistants to take over the breathing apparatus, and I went over to the priest, he says. I asked him, when is the proper time to declare one dead for the last rites? And I remember him saying, and I doubt it meets Catholic doctrine, well, if we can perform the last rites within an hour or so of the death, it's all right. And I returned to the head of the table and said to the others, I think you better look at this first, pointing toward the president's head. We have no way of resuscitating him. I think it's time to declare him dead. Dr. Kemp Clark, the only neurosurgeon in the room, put on a pair of gloves and quickly inspected the head wound. That was the first time anyone looked at it, says Jenkins. It took Dr. Clark only a moment to decide the wound was too massive. Dr. Perry was still doing a vigorous chest massage. It's too late, Mac, Clark said. The president's pulse had gone from 20 to 10 to 0, remembers Baxter, and Malcolm still pumped on his chest, and I said, no, Malcolm, we are through. Somebody was poised with a knife ready to do open chest massage, and I almost laid across his chest and said no. There was no way the president could survive, no matter what we did. The doctors had worked futilely for more than 20 minutes. And I said, recalls Dr. Peters, I think we need to find Mrs. Kennedy. And someone nudged me and signaled with their head behind me, and I turned, and she was right there. Dr. Baxter, the chief of the emergency room, walked over to Jacqueline and quietly said, Mrs. Kennedy, your husband is dead. We will not pronounce him until he has had the last rites. She had a look in her eyes, on her face, of terror, disbelief, and bewilderment. She was deadpan, with all those emotions in her eyes. It was like this really isn't happening. I could understand every emotion she was going through. When we decided to declare him dead, says Jenkins, people just started to fade away. They just disappeared from the room. Out of respect, no one wanted to stay after that point. With Mrs. Kennedy there, we were not about to start examining the wounds or turning the body over. No one even lifted the head, although a few doctors passed by and quickly looked at the wound. Dr. Baxter agreed. What happened once we knew we lost him, we were gone. Everyone backed off from that body with the reverence, with the grief, with all the emotions you can imagine. When I had gone into that room, I was emotional. When taking care of him, I was a doctor. As soon as it was over, I was filled with emotions, and I never touched him again, except to pull a sheet over him. As the room emptied, Dr. Baxter walked over to the president with Mrs. Kennedy. She kissed his toe, his stomach, his lips, and then slipped off a ring and put it on his little finger, he recalls. Then she began crying. It was heart-wrenching. Father Oscar Huber entered a minute later. I stayed because I had to take out the tracheostomy, Jenkins says. Take off the EKG leads we had. Take out the IVs and the other apparatus. I wanted to leave too, but I couldn't get out of the room because I was hemmed in by the priest and Mrs. Kennedy. When the last rites was being performed, I wish I had been elsewhere. Mrs. Kennedy looked just ghastly pale, with blood all over her dress. It was a terribly personal moment. Ken O'Donnell, one of the president's aides, tried to persuade Jacqueline to step outside after the last rites, but she refused to leave her husband's side. She remained while some nurses and residents wrapped the president in white sheets, a plastic mattress cover, and some pillowcases, and awaited the arrival of the casket. The attending doctors had decided to fix the time of death as 1 p.m., and since the cause of death was the massive head wound, decided that Dr. Clark, a neurosurgeon, should sign the death certificate. Mac Kilduff, a Kennedy aide, went to a side room where Vice President Johnson was under heavy Secret Service guard. Mr. President, he said, and by so addressing LBJ, notified him that Kennedy was dead. He informed Johnson that he wanted to announce Kennedy's death, but LBJ told him to wait until his party was away from the hospital. No one was sure who had killed the president, or if it was a conspiracy that targeted other members of the government. Johnson decided to return to Washington as soon as possible. Once Johnson was in the car on the way to the airport, Kilduff entered Parkland Classrooms 101-102, which had been converted into a temporary press hall. It was 1:33 when he mounted the dais, and there were shouts of "Quiet!" President John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 Central Standard Time today here in Dallas. There was a tremendous rush into the hospital corridors by newsmen hurrying to get the word over the wire services. While the drama with President Kennedy unfolded, another life-and-death battle was being waged with Governor John Connally. He had bullet wounds in his right rear shoulder, under his right nipple, right wrist, and his left thigh. Dr. Robert Shaw, a thoracic chest surgeon, took over the governor's care at 12:45. Within 45 minutes, Dr. Shaw had moved Connally to surgery and for nearly 2 hours sutured the governor's damaged lung and muscles. Note, on the following day, minor operations were done on both Connally's wrist and thigh. End note. His wounds were life-threatening, recalls Dr. Shaw, and without prompt care he would have died. When Connally was moved from the trauma room to the operating room, he was transferred from the stretcher on which he had been brought into the hospital to an operating table. That empty stretcher was placed into an elevator by an orderly and then moved into a hospital hallway. Gerald Tomlinson, the hospital's senior engineer, later bumped into it, and when he did, a 6.5-millimeter bullet rolled onto the floor. Note, there were 2 stretchers in the hallway he passed through. Tomlinson was not certain from which one the bullet had dropped, but only one was connected to the assassination, as President Kennedy's stretcher was never in that location. Tomlinson admitted he was not paying much attention when he bumped into it. That slightly deformed whole bullet was later determined to have been fired from Oswald's rifle to the exclusion of all others. Critics have dubbed it the magic bullet because the Warren Commission concluded it was responsible for President Kennedy's throat wound and all the wounds to Governor Connally. Yet the bullet had lost only 3 grains of its total weight of 161 grains, and its main deformity was a flattening but no crushing of the nose or significant fragmenting. It is discussed in detail in Chapter 14. End note. The president's body was placed into a casket and ready for transport back to Washington by 1:40. But by then, Dallas city officials informed JFK's staff that the body would have to remain in Texas, where the crime had been committed, for the autopsy. But unknown to the Texan authorities, Vice President Johnson was determined not to leave the state without the president's body. "When Mr. O'Donnell told us to get on the plane," recalled LBJ, "and go back to Washington, I asked about Mrs. Kennedy. O'Donnell told me that Mrs. Kennedy would not leave the hospital without the president's body, and urged again that we go ahead and take Air Force One and return to Washington. I did not want to go and leave Mrs. Kennedy in this situation. I said so, but I agreed we would board the airplane and wait until Mrs. Kennedy and the president's body were brought aboard the plane." The ensuing argument between the president's staff and Dallas and Parkland officials was heated. Theron Ward, a Dallas justice of the peace, was at the hospital but was weak in asserting Texas law. "He did nothing," recalled Dr. Earl Rose, the Dallas medical examiner. "He was frozen with fear." Some, such as Dr. Charles Crenshaw, claimed that the Secret Service agents drew their weapons and physically forced their way out of the hospital, stealing the bronze coffin from Texas jurisdiction. "Finally, without saying more, I simply stood aside," said Rose. "The law was broken, but I felt that it was unwise to do anything more to accelerate or exacerbate the tension. There was nothing else I could do to keep the body in Dallas. I had no minions, no armies to enforce the will of the medical examiner." The federal agents were indeed prepared to force their way out of the hospital with or without authorization. But most do not realize that Dr. Charles Baxter, chief of the emergency rooms, had authorized the body's removal. "At the time that fight was going on between Earl Rose and the Secret Service," Dr. Baxter told the author, "and I got involved in it, my thinking was twofold. One, the president was above state laws, and second, Earl was sort of a sensationalist, somebody always on the fringes, and I did not want him to do that autopsy. Earl was experienced and good, but I am sure he would have missed points that have since come up." At 2:04, Jacqueline Kennedy, 4 Secret Service agents, and Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh left in an ambulance for the airport with the president's coffin. They arrived at Love Field in 10 minutes and loaded the casket onto the rear of Air Force One at 2:18. Note: 4 seats had been removed from the back of the narrow Boeing 707, so the casket could be placed inside the main cabin. The casket was slightly damaged when it was removed from the hearse. Later that night, a mahogany replacement coffin was ordered. End note. Instead of immediately departing, Lyndon Johnson, after conferring with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, waited for a local judge to swear him in as president. That brief and somber ceremony took place in the front of the plane at 2:37, while a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy looked on in shock. After the ceremony, she returned to the rear of the plane, where she stayed with the casket for the remainder of the trip. David Lifton, in one of the most unusual conspiracy theories, claims in his book Best Evidence that the president's body was inside the Dallas casket when it was put aboard Air Force One at 2:18, but it was no longer inside the casket at 2:47 as the plane rolled down the runway. Lifton contends that the president's body was stolen from the casket while on the plane, directly under the eyes of Mrs. Kennedy and the president's personal staff. His theory relies on an elaborate shell game involving rapid exchanges of coffins, a decoy ambulance, and a switched body shroud. He contends that once the body was stolen from Air Force One, a covert team of surgeons surgically altered the corpse before the autopsy later that day at Bethesda. The alterations were purportedly done so the autopsy physicians would determine the bullets that hit the president were fired from the rear, from the direction of the book depository, thereby sealing the case against Oswald. Lifton does not think any shots from the rear hit President Kennedy. Yet, since the medical evidence only supports the conclusion that JFK was struck by shots from behind, Lifton tries hard to devise a theory of medical forgery to exonerate Oswald. According to Lifton, the covert team not only hid any evidence of front shots, but created rear wounds that had the correct trajectory angles to fit with a 6th-floor assassin from the book depository. Lifton's theory involves a massive plot of scores of conspirators in the Navy, Secret Service, and LBJ's inner circle, none of whom he identifies. Among other allegations, he uses eyewitness testimony from bit players at Bethesda, orderlies, technicians, and casket carriers, to allege that Kennedy's body arrived there in a body bag, although it had been sent from Dallas in sheets. In other words, the conspirators were sophisticated enough to steal the body but forgot to put it back in the same bag. He asserts the conspirators also made the mistake of forgetting to put the president back in the same bronze coffin, since he claims a simple gray metal one arrived at Bethesda. Even the president's brain was missing, as the conspirators had to hide it, but another one showed up during the autopsy. Lifton's purported smoking gun is a November 26, 1963 report by two FBI agents, Francis X. O'Neill and James W. Sibbert, in which they said that after the president's body was removed for the autopsy, it was also apparent that a tracheotomy had been performed, as well as surgery of the head area, namely in the top of the skull. Since no surgery was performed on the president's head at Parkland, Lifton concludes the surgery must have been done between Parkland and Bethesda. But that remark was an offhand comment by an attending physician at the autopsy and was misconstrued by the two non-medical FBI men. "We weren't doctors," O'Neill told the author, "and it was either Humes or Boswell, but I just wrote it down as I understood it. There wasn't any surgery on the head, only my misunderstanding of what the doctors were talking about." All of the physicians at Parkland and Bethesda unequivocally reject the notion there was any surgery on the head. Dr. Michael Baden, the chief forensic pathologist for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, says, "Lifton just doesn't know what he is talking about. It's a fantasy of his. He thinks he sees signs of surgery in some of the autopsy photos, but he doesn't know how to read those pictures. It's laughable. He's not a doctor, and it's clear by his work that he doesn't understand what really happened. He doesn't even take into account rigor mortis, the stiffness caused by death, which starts 2 hours after death. Surgery done on a corpse would look different than on a living person. His theory of medical alteration to the president is ridiculous." Even forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, the most vocal medical critic of the Warren Commission's conclusions, dismisses Lifton out of hand. "Lifton gets away with crap and no one challenges him. I could assemble a whole team of the best surgeons in the country and still not be able to accomplish in a day what Lifton says was done in a few hours. I have never bought his stuff. It can't be done." Beyond its medical impossibility, Lifton's entire scenario rests upon the president's casket being unattended on Air Force One for a few minutes, so that the body could be stolen. In a 700-page book, Lifton spends only 2 pages on this essential issue. Yet the casket was never unattended. Fulfilling the military duty that a high-ranking officer should remain as an honor guard with the body of a slain commander-in-chief until the burial, General Godfrey McHugh stayed with the casket after it was loaded onto the plane. He went to the cockpit to check on the plane's departure only when Mrs. Kennedy or one of the president's aides was in the rear. During LBJ's swearing-in ceremony, while almost everybody was in the front, McHugh remained with the casket. Note: moreover, stealing JFK's corpse from its Elgin Britannia coffin was not an easy task. The coffin had an airlock mechanism that, when turned, hermetically sealed the lid on the casket. It was sealed at Parkland. Aboard Air Force One, it had been strapped to the floor. To get the body out, the conspirators would have had to unstrap the coffin and unscrew the lock, allowing the unit to unseal itself. After removing the president's body, something of similar weight would likely have to be placed inside, so people handling the casket would not notice it was too light. Finally, the casket would have to be resealed and strapped back into its original position before anyone on the plane noticed the unusual activity. End note. There was no opportunity for JFK's body to be stolen any time before the autopsy. Note: Lifton spent an obsessive 15 years working on his assassination thesis. His book, Best Evidence, eventually became a national bestseller in 1980. Lifton's work has always been unusual. During the mid-1960s, he did his own photo enhancements of the shrubbery on the grassy knoll and concluded that one tree had been artificial on the day of the assassination in order to camouflage snipers. In his enhancements, Lifton believed he spotted a man wearing a Kaiser Wilhelm helmet, another with an electronic headset, one with a periscope, and another with a machine gun hidden in a hydraulic lift. He thought one of the men resembled General Douglas MacArthur. Despite his prodigious research, some experts still have little respect for his work. According to Professor David Rohn, a historian and assassin researcher, in 1967, Lifton had a theory of fake trees, that a construction company put in fake scenery and so forth at Dealey Plaza, and then, after the shooting, it was removed. He thought it helped the assassins get close for the shooting and also confuse the people. Lifton is a beast, does gross plundering. It's almost as though he is a religious convert, and he is proselytizing for a false religion. Robert Blakey, the chief counsel for the House Select Committee, says, Lifton is just bizarre. On a scale of 1 to 10, his theory is a 0. Richard Billings, editorial director of the House Select Committee, said the committee was aware of Lifton's theory and rejected it as illogical, even absurd. Billings called Lifton a master nitpicker and said his theory was a preposterous notion. And at best, the book is a monument to one man's ingenuity. At most, it is an appalling hoax. End note. During the flight from Texas to Washington, Admiral Berkeley, JFK's physician, spoke to Mrs. Kennedy about the autopsy. I stated an autopsy would be necessary, and that I was perfectly willing to arrange to have it done at any place that she felt it should be done. She said, Well, it doesn't have to be done. I said, Yes, it's mandatory that we have an autopsy. I can do it at the Army Hospital at Walter Reed, or at the Navy Hospital at Bethesda, or any civilian hospital that you would designate. However, I felt it should be a military hospital in that he had been President of the United States and was therefore the Commander-in-Chief of the military. After some consideration, she stated that she would like to have the President taken to Bethesda because he had been in the Navy. This was arranged by telephone from the plane, and it was accomplished. Note: there are those who believe even the autopsy physicians were part of a conspiracy. Yet Mrs. Kennedy was given the choice of which hospital she wanted for the procedure. The conspiracy plan would have required teams of conspirator doctors at both Walter Reed and Bethesda, as well as at key civilian hospitals in the area. Moreover, the body almost remained in Dallas for an autopsy, requiring further conspirators in that medical examiner's office. Lifton actually believes that President Kennedy's body was never supposed to have left Dallas unaltered. However, the plotters lost control of the body. The reason for that loss of control was a major accident, the shooting of Governor Connally. Again, Lifton bases his theories on an untenable hypothesis, that plotters, who were able to arrange for a secret team of assassins, frame Oswald, and plan an unprecedented medical forgery to cover up the crime, had forgotten to consider that Governor Connally, sitting only 24 inches directly in front of JFK, might be wounded from a bullet or a fragment. Even if Connally had not been wounded, it is difficult to imagine how any of the events in Dallas would have been different. Certainly, the president would have been taken to Parkland, the hospital listed as the primary stop in case of an emergency, and an effort would have been made to save his life. Yet, Lifton gives no indication whatsoever of how the medical deception involving Kennedy's corpse was to be carried out in Dallas. End note. Air Force One touched down at 5:58 Eastern Time at Andrews Air Force Base. Part of the extensive security to meet the plane included FBI agents Francis O'Neill and James Sibbert. The casket was lowered from the plane and then placed into the waiting ambulance, recalls O'Neill. The casket they lowered was the same bronze one that JFK was placed into at Parkland, and which was loaded onto Air Force One in Dallas. There was no sign of the simple gray casket that Lifton charged contained Kennedy's body on the arrival at Bethesda. Bobby Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy got into the ambulance, O'Neill told the author. Kellerman got into the front seat, and Greer was the driver. Admiral Berkeley was there. I was in the second car of the motorcade, and I observed that ambulance the whole time, every single moment, from the time it left the aircraft to the time that ambulance opened its door and I assisted in taking the casket inside. More than 3,000 people were crowded onto the hospital grounds, and they surged around the ambulance as it arrived. Sibbert and O'Neill helped take the casket inside, and there, waiting for the president's body, were Doctors James Humes and Dr. J. Thornton Boswell. Humes, a 39-year-old Navy commander, was director of labs of the Naval Medical School in Bethesda. Boswell, also a commander, was 41 and chief of pathology at the Navy Hospital. Humes had been notified at 5:15 when he was at home that he should return to the hospital. Canceling a dinner party for 24 guests, he rushed to Bethesda, where Admiral Ed Kenny, the Navy's Surgeon General, told him to be prepared to do an autopsy on JFK. Humes chose Boswell to be his assistant. Although they had performed several autopsies involving gunshots before, they did not have extensive experience with bullet wounds. Humes spoke to Dr. Bruce Smith, the deputy director of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, and asked for a pathologist with experience in gunshot deaths. Smith chose Dr. Pierre Fink. An Army colonel, Fink completed the autopsy team. He was a ballistics expert, and although he had reviewed records of U.S. military personnel who had died of gunshot wounds for nearly 10 years, he had never done an autopsy involving a gunshot wound. No forensic pathologist was included on the team. Note: hospital pathologists such as Humes and Boswell are not trained in the forensic aspect of autopsies or the search for clues in unnatural deaths, nor do they normally preserve evidence for subsequent medical or legal proceedings. Forensic pathologists are not just concerned with what caused the death, but also with the circumstances around the death. In 1963, there was little appreciation for the difference of the two very different types of autopsies available, says Dr. Baden. There was the usual hospital one, which is what the president received, and there was the forensic one. Most people mistakenly thought a pathologist was a pathologist. End note. When the funeral motorcade arrived at the hospital, Robert and Jacqueline Kennedy were escorted to upstairs waiting rooms while the casket was brought to the morgue. There, Doctors Humes and Boswell, with help from FBI agents O'Neill and Sibbert and Secret Service agents Kellerman and Greer, removed the body. O'Neill took responsibility for security, ensuring that no unauthorized personnel entered the area or had access to the body. It was a shocking experience, recalled Humes. We found the unclothed body of President John F. Kennedy wrapped in sheets in a swaddling manner, the massive head wound wrapped around and around with gauze and bandages. There was also a plastic liner inside, recalls O'Neill, and because of the massive amount of blood, some of it was stuck onto the body as well. Note: technicians Paul O'Connor and Gerald Custer claimed that the president's body was brought into the rear of the hospital in a simple gray metal coffin, and that he was zipped inside a military body bag. James Jenkins, a laboratory technician, said that a plain gray coffin containing the body of an Air Force officer in a body bag arrived at Bethesda before JFK's coffin. That may have created confusion among the technicians. But O'Connor and Custer also allege the president had no brain when he arrived. Custer even asserted that he put both his hands inside the president's head and it was empty. But they were not part of the team that removed the body, although O'Connor arrived later. They were both interviewed by the House Select Committee in 1978, and neither mentioned what they now claim to have witnessed. When O'Connor was interviewed by author Harrison Livingstone in 1990, he admitted, "It has been so many years and so